This is the eSwap X2 Pro controller. It comes in this really nice and fancy box. This guy's gonna work on the Xbox Series X and S, Xbox One, Windows 10 and 11. It's a wired controller, as you can see here. USB-C to USB-A. The wire itself is about 10 feet long. Alright, let's get into the build quality. This guy is built like a tank. No flex whatsoever. Honestly, this is the sturdiest controller I've ever had. It's crazy. Everything about this is heavy duty. If you're somebody who's really rough with your controllers, then maybe this controller is for you. I have large hands, so this controller fits me pretty good. But if you have smaller hands, this thing's not gonna fit you. And this is one of the heaviest controllers I've ever used. I have to constantly rest this on the table or against my thigh. I just can't comfortably hold one-handed like this between matches. And listen, man, I am not somebody who is weak, okay? Look at these vascular activities on my arms, okay? I work out every day. This is the first eSwap X Pro. And essentially they're identical to each other. Look at the new one and look at the old one. Maybe this thing is slightly smaller, but barely though. They look almost identical. And I get it, if something ain't broke, don't fix it. But the first one is not perfect. I was hoping that the second one is a lot better, but there isn't a lot of changes here. Let's start with the triggers. They're all the way out here. And look at this. My index fingers have to reach really far to press these triggers. If you look at an Xbox Series controller, you see how the trigger is slanted inward, making it a lot easier to press. Unfortunately for the X2, it's the same design as the first one. It's still way up here. You're not going to be able to reach these triggers if you have short fingers or small hands. Aside from the positioning, the triggers are fine. There's nothing wrong with them. They don't have a lot of travel to begin with, but you can also have a trigger lock. Here you go, just turn it on. In terms of tension, these are a little bit heavier than the Xbox controller. And for the shoulder buttons, there's this funky design here. Of course, you have the shoulder buttons on the outside, but it's cut off on the inner part of the shoulder buttons. It's as if they don't want us to use it over here. So you're forced to use the knuckles of your index fingers to press these. You get used to it, I got used to it. You don't accidentally touch them or anything. But if you're someone who likes to use the tip of your index fingers to press the shoulder buttons, you can't really do that here. One positive thing about this trigger being high up here is that it's close to the shoulder buttons, so you can switch between the two pretty quickly. Let's move on to the joysticks. These joysticks are pretty loose. In terms of smoothness when rotating this around, I would say it's average. The problem I have with this is that it's too tall for fighting games. Of course, with a taller joystick, you get more distance to cover, right? So if you're somebody who likes to use the joystick for fighting games, I'm gonna say this is probably not the best joystick for fighting games. Alright, let's talk about the face buttons. These guys use mice switches, but they are on the heavier side. Typically with mice switches, they sound like they're clicky, but they don't feel like they're clicky. However, these guys actually feel clicky. There's a little bit of kickback to them. And by kickback, I mean the button kind of spring back pretty quickly. They're pretty nice. They're positioned close together where you can press two buttons at once, no problem. And you can also play claw as well. Since these guys are positioned pretty high up here, so just wrap your hand around the handle here. Here's one difference between the X2 and the X1. You see the color of the face buttons is gold here. And on the first one, they used the Xbox color scheme. Doesn't really matter though. They kind of feel exactly the same. And look at this, even the function buttons are exactly the same. The only major difference that you can see here is the D-pad. You see the shape is definitely different. It's a little more compact and smooth. And check out the eSwap S. It's essentially the same D-pad. The only difference here is that this guy is not removable. Whereas with this guy, you can take it off. So you can change position of the joystick and the D-pad. So if you're somebody who prefers the D-pad to be up here, you can do that. However, if you position it this way, it's going to be really awkward. And the reason being is the D-pad is kind of positioned to the left. So to access the left button, your thumb gets pretty vertical with your hand. If you think about it, your thumb naturally points diagonally this way, right? So to position it vertically like this is pretty uncomfortable. In terms of the feel, even though these guys use my switches, they're pretty heavy. You gotta really press it all the way in for it to activate the directions. They're responsive, but you gotta be really heavy-handed with it. At first, I didn't like the heavy feel of it, but after a while, you get used to it though. And that's the theme of this controller. Everything about this controller is just super heavy. On the first one, the D-pad was okay, but the gap was really big. So it's kind of hard to do diagonals, especially for up forward. And also, the travel is very short. This D-pad was serviceable. I wouldn't say it's the greatest. And on the new one, you can definitely see the difference. There's a lot more travel for one. And the gaps between the directions are a lot smaller. So it's a lot easier to press diagonals. And also the edges are smoothed out. You see that? It's kind of curved down. Whereas on the original, you can really feel the edges. Not that they're sharp, but you can just feel them better. And on this guy, you can't really feel the edges that much. Well, why is that important? Take a look at the PlayStation D-pad here. When I want to do diagonal back, I can just feel the edges of the left button and the down button. And that's where I know that I need to press to execute a down back, right? But with this guy, it's a little bit harder. Because the surface area here is smooth, you can't really feel the difference between the edges, right? They all kind of feel the same. This feels like a disc. Initially, I had a lot of problem executing diagonals. In a game like DOA 6 here, diagonals are super important. In order to hold your opponents, you have to be super precise with each of the cardinal directions, right? Over time, I'm able to get adjusted to it, and diagonals are not a problem anymore. I can do all of my combos without any problems most of the time now. I would have preferred that the edges here is not round off so much though. Double taps are pretty accurate. And this is the difference between this guy versus the S. This guy just wouldn't work for me. It's just too slow. But on this guy, looks like they fixed it. It's a lot more responsive now. You can do backdash really quickly as well. Because of the smooth out edges, this thing feels more like a disc. And this makes it really easy for you to do motion inputs. No problem at all. Half circles and full circles are pretty easy to do with this D-pad. Unfortunately, if you want to do 2 full circles, you gotta use a joystick. Yo, that's a different animation. Dang, they updated the animation for the special move? That's crazy. And the reason why you can't do 2 full circle on this is because of the surface. This thing looks smooth, right? And it is smooth, but that's precisely the problem. If you have sweaty hands, sweaty fingers, this smooth surface actually causes friction. Whereas if you have something that's matte like this, it'll just go right through it. Look at that. No problem doing 2 full circular motions, see that? But with this, there's just too much friction if there's any type of moisture at all on your thumb. Charge moves are pretty easy to do. Even the double charge move. As long as you're not doing full circular motions, this D-pad is great for motion inputs. And I also feel that motion inputs by nature is pretty heavy-handed, right? You gotta slide your thumb all over the place, and that naturally makes using this heavy D-pad easier. Oh, I'm gonna have to check out the new animations for all of these special moves. I've got the Fighting Pack T-Mod here, and let's see if this guy works on it. Keep in mind, I got this T-Mod for the PS4 eSwap controller. I'm playing Street Fighter 6 on PC right now. Look at that. Works perfectly. The ability to take these out and switch them around is awesome. If I don't like this D-pad and prefer this D-pad, I can just take it out and put this guy in. Or if you prefer the old D-pad, you put that in and that works as well. You see how crazy that is? Honestly, the potentials are endless here. Now, if only Thrustmaster can make a D-pad that's like this, like on the Xbox Series X, that'll be perfect. I'll be the first one in line for it. The fact that you can have two D-pads at once is crazy to me, but it works. Look at this. You can press two directions at once. I'm thinking this setup right here is gonna be great for like Tetris or something, you know, like puzzle games. The last set of buttons I want to talk about are these back buttons. These are kind of small. You can see that they are raised at the bottom here for each of these buttons, and that's because they want you to press that way. Just press down, right? Initially, I didn't like the fact that they're so small, but honestly, these are not bad at all. They fit my hands pretty good. They're pretty easy to press. They're pretty clicky and tactile. And if I don't want to use them, they're out of the way, right? As opposed to paddle, they're going to be here and they're in the way. You can map them using this button. So I'm going to just press that. You're going to see the light blinking. I'm going to press one of the back buttons here, and then I'm going to program it to down. Now, the back button is down and I can do backwards backdash. Look at that. Isn't that cool or what? Alright, it's time for a polling rate test. For minimum input delay, I got 1.19 milliseconds. Maximum, we have 4.1 milliseconds. And 0.25 milliseconds for jitter, so that's really good. Average input delay, 3.9 milliseconds. And for polling rates, I have 256 Hz. This is not the fastest controller, but it's not slow either. I would say this is pretty good. It's essentially the same as the eSwap S, and it's comparable to the Reflex Pro here, also the 8-bit Dual Ultimate Xbox version. Anytime that you have an average input delay of less than 4 milliseconds, that's pretty good in my books. And this guy falls just under that. Alright, final thoughts. Even though there's not a lot of changes to the X2 versus the original, and this controller is by no means perfect, but I still think this is a pretty damn good controller for fighting games. Especially when you combine it with the Fighting Pack mod. I don't love the fact that the triggers are still way up here, and the D-pad is pretty heavy. But after you get over the hump and get used to it, this is one of the more accurate and reliable controllers I've used for fighting games. When you just compare this to the previous eSwap controllers, this is by far their best effort yet. And honestly, the ability to switch and change out different modules here is a game changer for me. If you don't like the positioning of it, you can switch it. If you don't like the D-pad, you can change it out for something else. If you're somebody with big hands and you're pretty heavy-handed with your controllers, you want something that's sturdy and hefty and heavy, I highly recommend this controller. On the flip side though, if you have smaller hands or if you don't like heavy switches, I recommend you use something else. Alright, that's gonna be it for me. Hopefully you found the video to be helpful. If you did, give it a like, subscribe for more, and take care now.